Daniel, you'll be presenting on the study of ice and fire. So these are studies, some of the studies he has done in the Sandhill Lake. Daniel had his first degree in the United Kingdom in the University of Loughborough, I guess. Sorry, I wanted that. And he's here in the ecosystem psychometry lab, a PhD student in his fourth year. So I'll hand over that to him.
Cool. Thanks, Uche. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel. As Uche said, I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the Corman or Ecosystem Stoichiometry Lab. And if you didn't get it, this was a play on Game of Thrones, a song of ice and fire. And so if you go and read the abstract for this seminar and then read the back of one of the Game of Thrones books, you might find some similarities. And jokes are always better when you explain them. So I'm going to be talking today about two studies I've done out in the Sand Hills. One is looking at the effects of wildfire ash on lake primary production and nutrient dynamics. And the other study is using satellite images to monitor ice cover in the Sandhill lakes and then try to determine environmental factors that drive lake ice cover. And so before I get started, I just wanted to thank the SNR GSA for giving me this opportunity to talk, as well as the USGS, the NSF, the Waterproof Food Institute, and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for funding my research. So yeah, PhD student here in the Corman Lab. I'm really interested in limnology, which is the study of inland waters. And I kind of specialize in nutrient stoichiometry and biogeochemical cycles. And so what that means is I'm really interested in understanding how elements, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, are cycled through aquatic systems and kind of what consequences that has for water quality and ecosystem functioning. All right, so moving on to wildfire effects on outgrowth and nutrient dynamics in the Sand Hills. So unless you've been living under a rock, you probably will have noticed that we had a lot of fires occurring this year, particularly in Canada. This is a map from the European Space Agency showing carbon monoxide concentrations over North America. And you can see kind of these hotspots up here in Canada where they had these massive forest fires. And this change or this increase in fire is related to a bunch of different factors, including climate change, management practices, as well as changes in fuel availability. And we see this not only in forest ecosystems, but also in grasslands. So this is a figure from a study by Victoria Donovan, who used to be at UNL, looking at fires in grassland systems. She was mainly focusing on the Great Plains, which is where we all live. And basically what she found was that there's been this huge increase in the number of wildfires from the 1990s all the way to the 2010s. But at the same time, the area burnt by wildfire has increased considerably over this period of time. And they link that to changes again in climate change, but also management practices, describe burns becoming more frequent and fuel availability is changing. And so in terrestrial systems, in terrestrial systems such as grasslands and forests, fire is recognized as a really important factor controlling ecosystem productivity and also nutrient cycles. So fire plays a really pivotal role in these systems kind of structuring their dynamics. For example, fire removes a bunch of biomass that would otherwise reduce light availability. It rejuvenates nutrient pools and kind of contributes to the healthy cycling or the healthy structure of these systems. However, we don't really know a lot about the impacts of fire on aquatic environments. But this is kind of surprising because if you have, for example, a lake here or a river, and you have a forest fire here, it doesn't take a large stretch of the imagination to think that this fire is going to influence the aquatic environment in some capacity. And so in a bunch of studies that have kind of looked at this, we have found changes in hydrology. Generally, when catchments burn, so the land surrounding a lake burns, we get an increase or a change in hydrology. Stream flow usually increases and discharge into these aquatic environments because there's less water being held in vegetation and biomass. We also get changes in the heat flux between aquatic and terrestrial environments, again, mainly because of changes in vegetation. And there's changes to material and nutrient export. And just kind of to highlight this last point, this is a figure from a 2014 study where they were looking at wildfires in the southern United States, I think in New Mexico, and you can just see how turbid and murky these water samples are following a fire. So clearly huge changes in the kind of physical environment surrounding or in aquatic bodies that have been burnt. What I'm really interested in, though, is the effect of fire on resource stoichiometry and resource quality. And I kind of want to use an example here. So imagine you have some kind of resource, in this case, a tree, or some form of organic matter, and that's composed of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, with 3 times as much nitrogen as phosphorus and twice as much nitrogen as phosphorus. So let's say we have this resource, and then we apply fire to it. What then happens is that we completely change the relative availability of this resource, because carbon and nitrogen are lost through fire to the atmosphere. And this really influences resource quality, because carbon-rich resources are generally poor quality. Organisms in aquatic environments can't do much with them. They much prefer these resources that are really rich in nitrogen and phosphorus relative to carbon. So fire has a really strong influence on the availability of nutrients in terrestrial ecosystems. And then if these resources are exported to aquatic systems, it can be quite influential there as well. And just to highlight this, this is a figure from a study that looked at the different combustion temperatures of different elements. And you can see down here, carbon kind of burns between 100 and 800 degrees Celsius. Nitrogen combusts between 200 and 500, but phosphorus has a much, much higher combustion temperature. So what this means is that any organic material we burn generally becomes enriched in phosphorus relative to carbon and nitrogen. Oh, these slides are a bit wrong, but what this might entail is a shift in nutrient limitation. For example, if you've got an ecosystem over here, and the yield of this ecosystem is constrained, for example, by phosphorus, and it's receiving this resource, then it isn't getting a lot of phosphorus because the resource is heavy in carbon and nitrogen. However, if we burn that resource and then deliver it, it's much more rich in phosphorus, and maybe this ecosystem becomes limited by nitrogen. So changing the composition of resources entering aquatic systems can have a big influence on their stoichiometry and also kind of on the primary production of these systems. And so I'm really interested in understanding kind of this component of how fire changes resource availability and how that influences aquatic systems. So yeah, and as I said, we know that this is important in terrestrial ecosystems, but really what is the effect on lakes? And so with that in mind, there's 3 questions I wanted to answer in this study. The first one was, what is the exposure of lakes to fires in grassland ecosystems? The second one was to look at whether wildfire ash is a source of phosphorus to grassland lakes. And then finally, to see if this ash influences primary production and nutrient limitation. So to answer the first question, what I did is a bunch of GIS mapping. This figure shows the aquatic bodies in the US in blue, and these red symbols are grassland fires occurring within the catchment of a lake. And we can see this is mainly occurring in the Great Plains, this region here. And what I found is about 7% of grassland fires occur within the catchment of a lake or a reservoir. So exposure to fire is relatively high. 7% isn't insignificant, I would say. And this has changed over time. So back here, this is just a graph showing the number of fires in grasslands and lake and reservoir catchments. And we can see that there's been a pretty large increase from the early 1980s to now. So exposure is there, and it is increasing over time. Okay, so to answer the other 2 questions, what I did is a bunch of bottle bioassays, which basically you take lake water, you put it in a bottle, you add a bunch of nutrients, and then you measure something after a certain amount of time. So we did 4 bottle bioassays over the summer 2023. Sorry, I can't. There's a bit of a typo there. And what we did is we added nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus with and without ash. And then we incubated these samples for 3 days and measured chlorophyll A at the end of the experiment. We measured gross primary production, which is this GPP, which is the sum of the respiration and the photosynthesis in these incubations. And we also measured changes in nutrients from before and afterwards. And this is just kind of a figure showing my experimental design. So you've got the control treatments, the nitrogen treatments, the phosphorus treatments, nitrogen and phosphorus, and the ash concentrations I used range from 5 milligrams to 100 milligrams per liter. And this is just a picture of a grassland wildfire close to Nebraska. This is where, close to Lincoln. This is where I got my ash from. You can see my footprint there. And these are just some pictures of the lakes I was working in, and they're pretty green. These are out in the western Sand Hills. These are naturally quite productive systems that are really eutrophic and have a very funky geochemistry. They're mainly evaporative lakes, so nutrients accumulate at a really high level in these systems. And this is just a figure of the kind of experimental setup. You can see all these bottle bioassays over here. So, and then we just dump them in a lake and leave them. Pretty easy to maintain. So what did we find? Well, one of the main results was that we found that ash had no influence on algal growth, but nitrogen had a huge influence. And so this figure shows chlorophyll A concentrations on the y-axis. Note that the y-axis is different for all of these 4 panels. These 4 panels are different lakes. The x-axis shows my ash concentration gradient, and then the colors are different treatments. So blue is control, yellow is in nitrogen, or yellow is for nitrogen, gray is for nitrogen and phosphorus added together, and then red is for phosphorus alone. And what you can see in almost all of these panels is that when we add nitrogen, either alone or in combination with phosphorus, chlorophyll A concentrations increase in almost all of these lakes. And this is really indicative of nitrogen limitation in the system. In comparison, the control and the phosphorus treatments are pretty much similar across this gradient of ash. It was also interesting to see that irrespectively of the ash concentration, there doesn't seem to be this relationship, or ash doesn't seem to influence the relationship between nitrogen and chlorophyll in these lakes. One lake didn't respond at all to any of our treatments. We had really poor weather during this this period when we ran this experiment. It was overcast, so I don't think much was happening. What we did find, though, was that ash increased phosphorus concentrations instead of treatment. So similar figure, except we have phosphorus concentrations on the y-axis and a fitted kind of trend line to all of these different treatments and lakes. And you can see there's generally a positive relationship between ash concentration and phosphorus. So there's a positive slope to all of these trend lines, indicating that phosphorus concentrations are increasing as we increase ash in these incubations. And this kind of suggests that ash is indeed a source of phosphorus to lakes. We also calculated phosphorus uptake to understand nutrient dynamics in the systems. Phosphorus uptake is basically the change in phosphorus concentration over time per unit of chlorophyll. So this results in micrograms of phosphorus taken up per micrograms of chlorophyll per hour. And generally, the idea here is that a positive number suggests that phosphorus is being taken up out in these bioassays, presumably due to biological activity, and a negative number means phosphorus is being released. And so what we saw is that there was pretty strong phosphorus uptake in all of our treatments except the phosphorus treatments. So phosphorus uptake on the y-axis and ash again on the x. The dashed line shows the zero treatment. And what was really interesting here is that generally there was this positive phosphorus uptake. It's been taken out of phosphorus has been removed from solution. But what we also found is that under nitrogen limited conditions, phosphorus is accumulating in these lakes. And kind of to show what I mean by this, I'm going to focus just on this one lake here, Border Lake. You can see this is the lake, or the water in this lake. It's really, really, really green. And it's practically impossible to work with because it's so kind of concentrated in dissolved particles that it's really tough to filter. But anyway, it's got a very, very low concentration of nitrogen relative to phosphorus. So 0.11 milligrams per liter of nitrate and 2.29 milligrams per liter of phosphate. This means that this lake is really, really enriched in phosphorus relative to nitrogen, and nitrogen is really limiting. And then if we look at the phosphorus uptake data, we can see that phosphorus uptake is really, really high under the nitrogen, or in the nitrogen treatment, and really low in the phosphorus treatment. So what's happening here is that we're seeing a shift in nutrient limitation. The phosphorus is being taken up only when it's been added with nitrogen. What this means is initially this lake is really limited by nitrogen, but then once we limit nitrogen, or once we add nitrogen, it shifts to phosphorus limitation, and therefore phosphorus is taken out of the solution, and we get these really, really low phosphorus concentrations, or really high uptake rates for phosphorus relative to all the other treatments where nitrogen is still limiting. And this just highlights how these elemental cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus are coupled in aquatic systems through biological activity. And you can see this if you look at a picture of the incubations. So this is the control, this is phosphorus, this is nitrogen and phosphorus, and this is nitrogen. And this is much, much greener than the other ones, suggesting that there's more biological activity going on here. There's more photosynthesis, more chlorophyll growing, more algae, and therefore they are removing phosphorus at a higher rate compared to these other treatments. So some initial conclusions were that ash did not really influence primary production or algal growth, but it did increase phosphorus concentrations, and that this mainly reflects a nitrogen limitation of the systems in the sandhills. But we also found that phosphorus uptake was linked to nitrogen availability, which was pretty cool. We also looked at the effect of ash on metabolism, which is basically the sum of photosynthesis and respiration in these systems. And we used a much higher ash concentration gradient going from 0 to 1,000 milligrams per liter. You can kind of see this gradient down here. So these are really, really rich in ash and should theoretically block out all light. And then we measured oxygen over a 24-hour period. And we found that indeed high ash concentrations decrease oxygen production in these systems. So these are time series for 48 hours in 4 different lakes. The y-axis shows oxygen, and you can kind of see these daily cycles in O2 production and consumption. So this was an evening measurement, and then oxygen decreases throughout the night to the morning, and then increases due to photosynthesis throughout the day. But what we also saw is that the oxygen concentrations were consistently the lowest in the really rich ash treatments. And just kind of to illustrate that here in these treatments, there just isn't a lot of oxygen being produced. And that's not really surprising, because what's happening is a trade-off between nutrient and light availability. So in this left figure here, I've plotted phosphorus concentrations as a function of ash in these bottles. And you can see there's generally a pretty strong increase in phosphorus as we increase the ash concentration. And over here, I've plotted the mean percent transmissions of light between 400 and 700 nanometers. You can think of this as photosynthetically available radiation as a function of ash concentration. And we can see there's this really strong nonlinear negative relationship. As you're increasing the amount of ash, there's less light in or available for these organisms. And we get an R-squared value of 1, which is very exciting. How often do you see that in ecology? Kind of putting all of that together, I came up with this conceptual model to explain how ash influences primary production in aquatic systems. So on the x-axis, you've got ash concentration. On the y-axis, you've got primary production. And there's this parabolic or quadratic relationship between those two variables. And so what's happening initially, when phosphorus is limiting, ash increases primary production because you're adding a nutrient to the system. However, we get a plateau when phosphorus is really abundant, and we switch to nitrogen limitation. And then light becomes limiting and primary production decreases again. Now, we didn't really see this in the Sandhill lakes, and that's probably because something like this is going on, where we have consistent nitrogen limitation that's stopping phosphorus from actually influencing the system, and that primary production kind of is unrelated to ash concentrations until we hit kind of this threshold where light starts to become limiting, and then primary production decreases. So kind of putting all that together, we also found that high ash concentrations over 500 milligrams per liter decreased gross primary production in these lakes, indicating general light limitation. However, the effects of fire on aquatic systems are really, really complex. And this is just a figure from a recent publication that shows that there's a bunch of different factors that influence how lakes respond to fire, relating to kind of the catchment, meteorological conditions, but also internal structure of the lake that modify how these systems respond. So much more work is kind of needed to look at these relationships. All right, moving on to the second part of the study. This is a manuscript that I wrote with my supervisor, Dr. Gschwentner, that we submitted recently, where we used satellite images to map ice cover for Sandhill lakes in Nebraska, and then relate this to environmental drivers. So lake ice is really, really important for a variety of reasons. So there's ecological significance. It's an important indicator of climate change. Changes or decreases in lake ice cover have been linked to increasing atmospheric temperatures. So we can monitor kind of changes in the climate or regional climates by looking at lake ice. There's important cultural value with lake ice, and it's of economic significance. And so in 2016, there was over $16 million spent alone on ice fishing in the US. So definitely quite important. There's also a bunch of ecological factors why you might care. Lake ice cover is related to stratification, oxygen dynamics, to temperature in the lakes, to nutrient mineralization and also organism life cycles. And there's also the effect of fish killers, something like this, where lake ice covers a lake, prevents oxygen from being circulated throughout the system, and then all these fish die of hypoxia or anoxia. And Dennis was actually telling me this happened to some turtles on Valentine National Wildlife Refuge this year. So if you care about herpetology or reptiles, lake ice is apparently also important. And this is an article written by Daryl Bauer from Nebraska Game and Parks on Sandhill's winter kill summary for last year, so 2022 to 2023. And they found actually quite a few number of lakes in Nebraska suffered significant winter fish kill. And they thought this was mainly because they had a really, really strong ice cover that was insulated by a thick layer of snow. So definitely important. And globally, we're seeing a decline in lake ice driven by climate change primarily. What is, however, surprising is there's absolutely no lake ice data for Nebraska. I kind of searched high and low. I got in touch with Game and Parks and other people who might have this data, but no one records this. And some reasons for this might be these lakes are generally remote and difficult to access. Land ownership is a huge issue. I think 90% of Nebraska is privately owned, so it's difficult for people to monitor kind of these environments. And there's a bunch of really small lakes and thousands of ponds and wetlands, so it's logistically kind of impossible to monitor lake ice cover in these systems. However, this is where remote sensing comes in, where we can use satellites to kind of monitor the Earth and detect things that would be very difficult to measure otherwise. So I had three major questions here to figure out: when do Sandhill lakes freeze and when do they thaw? How long does ice cover last? And then what factors control lake ice cover in these lakes? And so what I did is I manually inspected a bunch of satellite images for 128 lakes in Nebraska. So these lakes were all larger than half a square kilometer. And these were really high resolution satellite images with about a pixel size of 5 meters and a revisit time of 2 to 5 days. This was a total of, I think, 900 or 1,000 satellite images that I manually clicked through for all of these lakes to kind of figure out when is ice cover present and when is ice cover not present. And we defined ice on, or the date of ice on, as the first day of the year when ice covered the entire lake, so completely ice covered, and then ice off as the first day of the year when there was absolutely no ice on the lake. And then we did some mixed effects modeling to figure out whether environmental factors such as climate or lake-specific factors such as lake area or shoreline length were influencing lake ice dynamics. And so these are the lakes in the study, scattered throughout the Sand Hills. You can see the outline of the Sand Hills relative to Nebraska here, and just kind of to reiterate how large of an environment this is and how difficult this would be to do, on the ground. Pretty much impossible to visit all of these lakes regularly to figure out if ice cover is present or not. And these are some lovely pictures of these lakes from the Platte Basin Time-Lapse project. Here's a really, really nice one. Who knew that Nebraska looked like this, right? Looks really great. And here are just two satellite images showing this lake ice cover definition that I had. So over here, these lakes aren't frozen because there's a bunch of open water, but over here, they're completely frozen. So some results. I found that ice on generally occurs in December, and then ice off generally occurs in March to April. And so these figures show density distributions of the Julian day of ice on and ice off. So ice on is up here, and you can see for the majority of the years from 2016 to 2023, ice on occurs at the end of November and then going into early December. 2023 was a real outlier here, where we had ice cover for a lot of lakes as early as kind of end of October going into early November. And then in contrast, ice off generally occurs in March for all of these years. 2023 again is a real outlier, shifting into April, which was pretty cool to see. We also found that the average ice cover duration was 112 days. So almost 3 months of ice cover on these lakes. That's a lot of time where these lakes are actually covered by ice and we know nothing about them. So that is definitely an impetus for future research to go out and look what's happening there. And we also found that the shortest ice cover occurred in 2016, where we had about an average of 94 days of ice cover. And then the longest was in 2022 and 2023, where we had 144 days. And this is just a figure showing the box plots of the ice cover duration in days for these different years. And you can see there's also considerable interannual variability, no clear trend, but they definitely bounce around a lot. The letters up here denote statistically significant different groups. And you can see that 2022, 2023 is again a real outlier where we had really long ice cover relative to these other years. But there's also a lot of variation going on here. Some lakes generally freeze a lot earlier or later than others. And so when we did our kind of mixed effects modeling, we found that the only factor that really influenced lake ice cover was atmospheric temperature. So I plotted the lake ice duration or the ice cover duration for all of these lakes as a function of mean temperature or mean atmospheric temperature from February to April here. The black line shows kind of the mean regression line, and these gray lines show the 95% confidence intervals and the colors of the different years. And you can see there's this really, really strong relationship there. The warmer February to March and April temperatures are, the shorter lake ice duration is out in the Sandhills. And if you look at kind of the average values of ice cover duration and temperature during this time period, you kind of see the same relationship. Again, 2022, 2023 kind of stands out here, where we had a really long ice cover or period of ice cover, despite relatively warm atmospheric temperatures. And this is probably because we had so much snow last year out in the Sandhills that kind of insulated these systems thermally from the environment, kind of promoting prolonging the lake ice cover. We also wanted to look at long-term trends in temperature and look at see whether lake ice might have increased or decreased throughout the 20th century. So we got a 40-year temperature record from Valentine, so in the northern Sandhills, and I plotted the February, March, April mean temperature in black and the October, November, December mean temperature with this dashed line here. But basically, you can see there's actually no trend here. Temperature has just fluctuated considerably over the last 40 or so years up by Valentine, so no clear trends there, unfortunately. However, looking forward, this is a figure of the observed and projected temperature trends for Nebraska. So down here is the measured temperature trend. The green shaded area is the lower emission scenario, and the red is the higher emission scenario. And the bottom line here is we are headed for considerable warming, irrespectively of whether we lower emissions or not. And in Nebraska, this translates to about 4 to 9 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That's a lot. And we're also seeing a loss in the number of really, really cold days and nights. So this graph just shows the number of days with minimum temperature of less than 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see there's generally been a decrease over the last 100 years. Yeah, and by the end of the century, we're going to lose between 15 and 20 more days, or 20 more days where the temperatures drop below freezing. Kind of putting this information into our model means that ice cover is probably going to decrease between 16 and 35 days, which accounts between 14 and 31% loss of lake ice cover duration-wise. There's also going to be changes in the seasonality of atmospheric temperatures and the number of freezing days, which will probably reduce or increase this loss considerably going into the future. And so what this means, we're going from a scenario where we have lake ice and where penguins are pretty happy, if we had penguins, to a scenario where we don't have a lot of lake ice and penguins are unhappy or dead if we had penguins. But generally, looking forward, we can expect a loss in lake ice. So overall, a shorter lake ice cover duration has implications for ice fishing. It becomes less safe if the seasonality of lake ice changes and if lake ice becomes thinner because of warming atmospheres. So reduced ice thickness probably will also happen in combination with warming. And then we might also see fewer winter fish kills, though, because lake ice cover is weaker and oxygen can circulate more throughout these systems. However, there's generally no research on Nebraska lakes during the winter, despite the fact that they're covered for almost 3 months. So this is really a key area if anyone's interested kind of in limnology in the state. Look at winter dynamics in these lakes. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Dennis, you promised you wouldn't heckle, so
What's that?
you promised you wouldn't heckle.
I'm not gonna heckle you.
Okay.
Considering the fire, have you or anybody you know looked at macro inverts in conjunction with the fire?
I know some people have done that in Arizona, and generally macrovertebrate diversity plummets completely, but they come back really quickly. So within a couple of weeks, kind of the communities are restored. So it's a relatively short-term disturbance. However, the effects of fire in that sense are pretty complex. There's this issue of scale and continued export of material or ash from a catchment. And if you completely burn a catchment and there's long-term export, I wouldn't be surprised that the macrovertebrate communities cannot respond as quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Nice talk, Daniel. I really hope this figure made it into the paper.
Yeah, definitely.
In the first study you talked about, you saw a general increase in phosphorus with increase in ash, right? But it seemed like there was one market exception to that in the control in Crescent Lake, if I remember right. Do you have any ideas what's going on there?
What might be happening there is Crescent Lake had really, really low phosphorus concentrations, around 5 micrograms per liter. So it could potentially be that it was actually taken up into either biomass or something like that. I'd have to go back and look very closely at the figures to see if the phosphorus uptake data kind of suggests that. But I could imagine that it's just been taken out of solution at a rate higher than it is supplied by the ash. And then again, the ash concentrations I used were pretty low, I think, after conducting the experiment. So I'm sure if you increased kind of that gradient to higher concentrations, you would see much more phosphorus release.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really well done, and I really appreciated the way you walked us through your figures and stuff. It was really clear and helpful. I was curious about your thoughts of like how microbial communities in the lakes may be mediating what's going on with the nutrients, given that they oftentimes are carbon limited in a system.
In these sandhill lakes, carbon limitation, but it might occur, but organic carbon is incredibly abundant in these systems. So really, really, really nutrient rich in that sense. I wouldn't be surprised if under these limiting conditions when nitrogen is really low or phosphorus is really low, the microbes outcompete the algae because they're known to be better scavengers under these really, really low conditions. But they certainly are quite influential in the sandhills, especially in the very, very productive lakes. We don't have a lot of data around well, we have, as far as I know, very little data on microbial communities out there, and also how they influence important processes like nitrogen fixation or nutrient mineralization, but it probably is quite significant. These lakes are almost all closed basin systems and are they're not very well connected to their catchments. The catchments are pretty flat and there's limited overland input. So a lot of nutrients in terms of nitrogen and carbon that are getting into the lake are fixed from the atmosphere. So microbes probably play a really important role there as well with respect to nitrogen fixation.
Cool, awesome, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm sure I'll see most of you around, so feel free to ask.
No, thank you very much. So the next presentation will be on the 20th of October. So let's plan for that. And also we have happy hour after now at the Leighton Pub Hall. So let's also plan for that. Thank you, everyone.
SNR is paying.